This is KCCK's Culture Crawl. I'm Dennis Green, and my guest today is Melissa Porter, Museum Program Manager at Brucemore in Cedar Rapids. Melissa, welcome.
Thank you.
Hey, before we start talking specifically about the programs you have coming up, about the Starch Works explosion, of which this is a big anniversary for, tell me just in general, how are things going at Brucemore? Of course, it's spring, so the grounds are starting to green up.
Yep, things are starting to sprout in the gardens. We're coming back from a long, cold winter, so it's nice to see the green again. And then, of course, we're kicking off spring season with a lot of specialty tours, and before we know it, we'll have summer programming too.
Yeah, and all the fun and outdoor events, concerts, and everything.
Yeah.
And next thing you know, it'll be Bruce Orchestra time.
Yes, yep. It always flies by, but a great time out there.
So what an interesting thing to, I don't want to celebrate, but to observe.
Yeah.
Because you have several programs coming up. One coming up next week, and then a couple more as the spring progresses, because it's the 100th anniversary of the Douglas Starch Works explosion.
That's exactly right.
And as a fan of Cedar Rapids history, I'm familiar with this. But for those who aren't, it was a huge, disaster in Cedar Rapids history.
It was. So the Douglas Starch Works was a large industry on the banks of the Cedar River. At the time of the explosion, it was employing somewhere between 650 and 700 people. So a good portion of the population was employed there. An accident at the plant caught some starch dust on fire and caused an explosion. The explosion boomed across Cedar Rapids. The plant itself experienced quite a bit of destruction, but many people don't know that businesses in the downtown district were stopped because they lost windows or homes damaged across the city. So it really was an impactful event. Had a lot of change across Cedar Rapids, and it resulted in the deaths of 44 people.
And the Starch Works was owned by the Douglas family, who were the second owners.
That's right.
Of Brucemore, and would have been in Brucemore at the time.
Yep. George Douglas and his brother Walter founded the company. George Douglas is actually the one who gave Brucemore its name. George Bruce Douglas took his middle name. His brother Walter had already retired from the company, and 5 years prior to the explosion, he'd actually passed away. He was aboard the Titanic when it sank.
And the Starch Works were located, you said, on the banks of the Cedar River, right about where the factory is there now.
Yeah. The company was able to sort of stay together after the explosion. It was a pretty tumultuous time. 700 or so people were facing unemployment if the company wasn't able to come back. But they were able to sell to Pennock and Ford, which later became Penford, and today the modern iteration is Ingredion.
And there is still, that plant is still on pretty much on the site of the original location.
Yeah, yep.
So for well over 100 years, it's been there.
Yeah.
Well, so this is, so as like I said, in observing this, it's a little bit tricky, coming up with the appropriate tone and the way to do it. As you said, it was a seminal event in the early part of the 20th century in Cedar Rapids. So tell me a little bit about how you as a manager and as a staff at Brucemore, you approached bringing this anniversary out to the community.
Yeah. So to us, it was important. We know a good portion of George's story. George Douglas is very key to Brucemore's story, but we wanted to make sure we weren't just telling his story, but the workers that were involved in this, the families that were impacted, the homes, the businesses, all of that. And so when we were planning the programming, we tried to intentionally take a look at how we could bring their story to light. Which isn't something that's often done because those resources are so limited. And so we tried to figure out different ways we could talk about those stories. So the first opportunity to do that is actually next week on April 15th. We're having a conversation with some partners from the African American Museum of Iowa, the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library, and the University of Iowa Labor Center. An opportunity to talk about some of the larger themes of what was going on in Cedar Rapids at the time in terms of race, migration, immigration, labor. All of those things are such important components of the history too.
Well, and it was Sinclair, and then I'm sure Douglas also, who employed a lot of particularly the Czech immigrants.
Yeah,
because it was Sinclair, I think, who brought. Was it he who brought the first wave of Czech immigrants
That's right.
here to
Thomas
work in
Sinclair's-
his meatpacking company.
And then, of course, his widow, Caroline Sinclair, is responsible for building Brucemore. But all of those industries, the early industries in Cedar Rapids, George Douglas's father was also involved in the founding of what today is Quaker Oats. And all of those early industries really helped attract different populations to the Cedar Rapids area, which also played a role in some of the cultural development that we see in the city as well.
Talking with Melissa from Brucemore about observations surrounding the 100th anniversary of the Douglas Starch Works explosion in Cedar Rapids. So, conversation kind of giving the overview of what was happening in terms of labor and culture at the time. Give us just a little bit of a capsule on what's going to happen with the events in May, which is the actual anniversary.
Absolutely. So on May 20th, we're hosting a wreath-laying ceremony. We really wanted to have an opportunity to commemorate the lives that were lost in that explosion. 44 people lost their lives. The Douglas Company created a memorial at Linwood Cemetery, and we are going to be at Linwood to commemorate the anniversary of that event. Mayor Brad Hart is giving some remarks at that, as well as some other local performers, speakers. Aqui Nagy is doing an original spoken word piece at that as well. And then 2 days later, on the actual anniversary of the date of the explosion, we're going to be doing a chalking project. The project is a little bit different than anything we've done before. We're inviting individuals and community members to go out across the city of Cedar Rapids and mark and chalk the locations impacted by the explosion. Part of our goal in that is helping visitors, people who might not know about the history of the explosion, have an opportunity to sort of stumble across their own community history. You might walk outside your door that day and find out one of the people who died in the explosion was actually a neighbor of yours, or this business you go to downtown, well, they were impacted by the explosion. And our goal is to create some different connections with that history.
Something that even for people who are familiar with the explosion itself probably didn't think about its effect on the rest of the city.
Yeah.
Physically, I mean, it's the equivalent of a giant bomb going off
It is.
right near downtown.
Yeah, and for people, it's interesting to hear read the eyewitness accounts. People sitting in their homes thinking, "Oh, surely it was my furnace exploding because it was too loud to be coming from anywhere but inside my house." Or someone thought maybe that they were being attacked by a different country. This was just 6 months after World War I ended, so people were a little bit afraid that it was maybe the Germans bombing the city. All to come to find out, it was actually an explosion at the Starch Works plant.
So the first of several different observances coming up on April 15th. And again, where and when?
It will be at 6 o'clock at the Cedar Rapids Public Library in the Whipple Auditorium. It's free to the public. Everyone is welcome to attend. And as I mentioned before, we've got partners from different local organizations, including the African American Museum of Iowa, Czech and Slovak, and the University of Iowa Labor Center.
And I'll bet that you're putting up some archival information and things of interest on your website, too.
Absolutely. So on our website, there's a lot of information about the Starch Works explosion. Beyond that, if you go to douglasstarchworks.org, you'll be able to see an interactive map of all of the locations impacted by the explosion, as well as read some more information about our different programs, the history of the event, and some of the other partnerships we're working on.
Okay, well, brucemore.org or douglasstarchworks.org if you'd like to know more about this big event in the history of Cedar Rapids, or check out more information on the upcoming observances. Melissa, thanks so much for being here
Thank
today.
you for having me.
You can hear the Culture Crawl live on the radio most Thursdays and Fridays at 10:20, or download and watch or listen to the video podcast using your favorite podcast catcher or at kcck.org/culture. I'm Dennis Green.